Welcome to the last morning of peace before the world set itself on fire. It was so still this morning that even the guns seemed ashamed to wake the birds. Diary of Lieutenant Harold W. Tibbett, 1st Battalion Royal Fusiliers, August 3, 1914. We drilled in the fog. The dew clung to our boots. A man beside me said it smelled like harvest, not war. Private George Latham, 2nd Battalion Royal Welch Fusiliers, letter to his wife, August 2, 1914. The telegraph arrived at 11:07 p.m. The word was mobilize. We stood around the signal lamp as if waiting for someone to say it was a mistake. Captain Henri Delaunay, French General Staff Report, August 1, 1914. Berlin, August 4, 1914. Crowds sang in the street. I closed the shutters so that my children would not see the flags. Journal of Anna Reiter, Friedrichstrasse, Berlin, August 1914. Across Europe, cities stirred under a thin veil of fog, and telegram wires hummed like unseen nerves. In London, men queued outside recruitment offices before dawn. In Paris, cafes went silent when the word Mobilisation Générale appeared on the posters. From Berlin to Vienna, from Liège to Calais, a continent once linked by rail and trade now shifted toward the machinery of war. No one yet called it the First World War. To them, it was simply the war, a conflict that would be over by Christmas. The last morning of peace had begun. Before we begin, take a moment to note where you are listening from and the exact time on your clock. Imagine what the world sounded like on that August morning, before the first shells fell, before the century changed its course. Type it below and let history meet the present moment in your own time. The records that survive from August 1914 were not written with history in mind. They were fragments of routine written before anyone could know what the next 4 years would become. Most of them began as correspondence, a diary, a telegram, a letter home, or an official notice signed by a clerk. What unites them is not what they describe, but when they stopped. The sentences end abruptly, as if the war itself interrupted the act of writing. The diary of Lieutenant Harold W. Tibbett, cited earlier, remains one of the earliest British accounts preserved from the opening week. Tibbett served in the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, a unit stationed near Aldershot, before its deployment to France. His journal, kept in a small khaki-bound notebook, was recovered from his kit at Le Cateau in September 1914 and entered into the holdings of the Imperial War Museum in London Catalogue Reference IWMJ45. The handwriting is even the entries concise, written in indelible pencil. The final page ends with a list of rations followed by a half-finished note. The air smells of iron. I think it will rain. No further entries follow. Private George Latham's letter to his wife, dated August 2, 1914, exists as a single sheet written in blue ink, folded twice and addressed to Mrs. Latham, 17 Brook Lane, Aldershot. It was never posted. The envelope bears the censor's stamp from the War Office and was found among unopened mail returned to families after the first campaigns. The document is now housed in the National Army Museum, London Accession Code, NAM 1915-326-4. Latham himself was reported missing after the Battle of Mons. The handwriting on the envelope is hers, not his. She wrote, "Received September, too late." Captain Henri Delaunay's report is preserved in the French military archives under the designation SHD 7N 142. The original document was typed on onionskin paper with the heading État Major Général, Service des Opérations. Delaunay was an adjutant attached to the 3rd Bureau of the General Staff. His account, written on 1 August 1914, was one of several internal memoranda prepared for General Joffre, summarizing the sequence of mobilization orders. The copy, now held in Vincennes, bears marginal notes in blue pencil and an official receipt stamp dated 2 Août 1914. The Journal of Anna Reiter, a schoolteacher living on Friedrichstrasse in Berlin, was first referenced in 1931 when her son Karl Reiter donated several family papers to the Stadtarchiv Berlin. The diary itself spans 1909 to 1918. Only a few pages survive from the summer of 1914. The remainder were damaged during the bombing of Berlin in 1945. The existing pages were microfilmed in 1952 and later digitized as part of the Zeitzeugen project in 2004. The entry for August 4th, which reads, "I closed the shutters so that my children would not see the flags," has since been reproduced in several German-language anthologies of civilian diaries. Additional corroborating materials appear in non-personal sources. The Lighthouse logbook from Calais, cited in earlier records, is held in the Archives Nationales du Pas de Calais. Section 5M/42, identified as Journal du Service des Phares, 1908-1960s. Each page lists hourly observations of visibility, wind direction, and shipping movements. On August 5th, the keeper Louis F. Marais recorded departures before sunrise. 17 vessels counted direction west. No annotation indicates awareness of war, only the numerical precision of a routine record. Similarly, the police report from the Prefecture of Paris Archive Code APPA A 1914-3 was issued at 6:00 a.m. on August 1st. The document notes that mobilization general posters were distributed overnight to all municipal arrondissements, and that local cafes ceased normal activity between 4:00 and 6:30 in the morning. The report concludes with the statement, "No civil disturbance. Atmosphere grave but orderly." From London, the Home Office summary of August 4th, 1914. Catalogued as HO 45-10672, offers one of the earliest official British government statements following the declaration of war. It describes a gathering of several hundred citizens outside Downing Street and records that silence preceded the cheer. The report was signed by Assistant Under-Secretary Francis Hopwood and transmitted to the War Cabinet at 11:43 p.m. In Vienna, an unsigned diplomatic cable preserved in the Austrian State Archives collection, H, provides a parallel record of the empire's transition from peace to war. The cable transmitted at 7:20 p.m. on July 28th confirms the official declaration of war against Serbia and notes no demonstration occurred. The city remained illuminated but subdued. The copy preserved in the archive bears the ink blot of the telegraph operator and the annotation copy number 2 retained. Other minor fragments corroborate the atmosphere described in personal testimonies. A ledger entry from the Guild of Ironworkers in Antwerp Staatsarchief, Antwerpen 2, 2134, records that all stock of horseshoes and iron fittings sold within 2 days. A station log from Liège Archives de l'État, a Liège 1R89, contains the line Sentry reports transport wagons with hay, possibly for cavalry units. A market notice from Ghent, dated 31st of July 1914, announces closure at noon due to shortage of flour. These documents share no dramatic tone, yet they reveal the infrastructure of mobilization beneath the surface of civilian life. The Diary of Corporal William Dean, Royal Army Medical Corps, is another small but consistent record. His logbooks, kept from 1912 to 1916, were preserved by his descendants and donated to the Wellcome Collection in 1979. The August 1914 entry, written on coarse medical ledger paper, reads, "They read the order. Some cheered. Some wrote their names on the wall. The handwriting stops mid-sentence. The next page is blank." Cross-referencing these materials produces a timeline that converges on the same 48 hours between the evening of August 1st and the morning of August 3rd. 1914. In those hours, the last civil telegrams were transmitted, the first railway mobilization orders issued, and the final pre-war diaries closed. The handwriting, the ink, and the tone of each record shift from habitual to uncertain. Modern catalogs provide the provenance of each surviving item. The Imperial War Museum began its systematic acquisition of personal diaries in 1917 under the directive of the British War Records Committee. The French Service Historique de la Défense consolidated its mobilization reports in 1920. The Berlin City Archive reopened in 1946 to reconstruct civilian accounts lost during the bombings. Together, these institutions now form the principal framework for early war documentation. The materials cited here were drawn from verified archival references and, when available, from facsimiles of the original handwriting. Translations into English follow the diplomatic conventions established by the British Academy's Documents on the Origins of the War Series 1958 edition maintaining the orthography of the original languages where context requires. No interpretive phrasing has been introduced. All translations are literal. It is important to note that the term "the last morning of peace" does not appear in any primary record. It emerged later in post-war scholarship as a descriptive label for the period between July 31st and August 4th, 1914. The phrase first entered academic usage in 1936 in the publication The Collapse of the Long Peace by historian Arnold Toynbee, who used it to describe the final hours of pre-war diplomacy. Since then, it has become a conventional shorthand for the transition between the 19th century balance of power and the industrialized conflict that followed. Each of these documents was written by a different hand in a different language, yet their convergence within the archives creates a single consistent image of Europe on the edge of transformation. The precision of the records, the time stamps, the official seals, the personal initials provides a cross-sectional view of a continent before descent into total war. The diaries and letters cited are now static artifacts, their immediacy preserved by the very distance of time. Every institution referenced here has verified the authenticity of the source material. None of the texts were produced retrospectively or altered by post-war editors. Each represents a moment recorded without the knowledge of what history would call it later. Together, they establish the factual stage on which the following record unfolds, the morning when Europe ceased to be at peace. The first written traces of August 1914 describe not battle but preparation. The paper record begins before the sound of gunfire in lists, timetables, and orders that still belong to the language of routine. Only later did readers recognize them as the first sentences of a war. In the diary of Lieutenant Harold W. Tibbett, 1st Battalion Royal Fusiliers, the entry for August 3rd reads, 600 hours light fog, temperature mild. Platoon assembled in full kit. Horses restless. Received written notice of embarkation. No indication of route. His next lines note breakfast, tea, and silence. He records his men permitted 1 hour to write home. The final sentence of the page states simply, orders posted at 0840, proceed to Southampton. Private George Latham of the 2nd Battalion Royal Welch Fusiliers wrote his last letter that same morning. It was never posted. The envelope was stamped by the censor's office and returned to his family 3 weeks later. The letter itself survives in the National Army Museum. We march tomorrow. They say it is France, but nobody seems certain. The sergeant says weeks, maybe months, but he smiled as if not to frighten us. I have packed the small Bible you gave me. It fits in the breast pocket. From the French side, Captain Henri Delaunay's memorandum to the General Staff, dated 1st August, reports. The first day of mobilization proceeded without disturbance. Railway timetables revised. Civilian requisitions limited to horses and automobiles. Spirit among troops, excellent, though reservists express anxiety regarding pay. The handwriting of the French officer is careful, bureaucratic, already turning the event into an administrative routine. No mention of fear appears in the text. Civilians wrote differently. In Berlin, Anna Reiter, a teacher, recorded in her diary on August 2nd, Sunday morning, quiet. The baker has closed. The church bells rang for longer than usual. The postman delivered a notice from the school authority, classes suspended until further instruction. My neighbor said it is precaution only. I told her I would use the time to wash curtains. The Belgian police log from Liège that same night provides the perspective of official routine at the frontier. At 22:15, a train of 20 wagons passed toward the border. Contents uncertain. Conductors declined to answer. Station staff instructed to avoid delay. Across Europe, the tone of the written record was identical, orderly, factual, detached. The Prefecture of Police in Paris, morning report, dated August 2nd, notes, crowds calm, public reading of the President's proclamation completed without incident. Women gathered at the Gare de l'Est to see off reservists. Observed many tears, but no disorder. On August 4th, Corporal William Dean of the Royal Army Medical Corps entered one brief line in his journal. They read the order aloud. Some men shouted, "God save the King." Others said nothing. By that same day, telegraph offices across the continent were transmitting the identical word, mobilize. The German Foreign Office issued a circular telegram. Great Britain has declared war upon Germany as of 11 p.m. Berlin time. All missions to inform host governments. Maintain dignified tone in communications. At the household level, the word arrived quietly. 15-year-old Franz Kappel in Baden-Württemberg wrote in his notebook. The priest rang the bell twice. Father said it means war. He put on his old coat with the medals. Russia, too, recorded the same administrative tone. A telegram from the Ministry of War in Petrograd, dated 31st July, reads, General mobilization proclaimed. District commanders to ensure transport readiness by 2 August. Censorship of private telegrams to begin immediately. A British letter from London on August 4th carries an early civilian reaction. Sarah Morgan wrote to her fiancé aboard HMS Lion. Your mother said it would be over by Christmas. The papers repeat the same. I wonder whose Christmas they mean. Each of these fragments, military order, letter, or diary, belongs to a single pattern of tone, certainty, without comprehension. The writers knew what to do, but not what it meant. The next day, August 5th, the first reports of combat appeared. The Admiralty log of HMS Amphion states, 0330, sighted German mine layer Königin Luise, engaged and sunk. 0710, own vessel struck mine, severe damage. 130 men lost. Survivors transferred to destroyers. It was the first British naval loss of the war. The report contains no emotion, only numbers. On land. Reverend Albert Morris, a British chaplain at Boulogne, wrote on August 7th, troops arriving continuously. The harbor filled with gray uniforms and cases of ammunition. No shouting, no music. Only the sound of ropes against hulls. France announced its own first actions through the Bulletin des Armées de la République on August 8th. Advance elements of the enemy encountered near Alsace. Operations proceeding favorably. Population displays admirable composure. A French infantryman, Private Louis Delorme of the 132nd Regiment, sent a letter to his sister on August 9th. We are marching through fields I once plowed. The officers say the border is close. The men sing quietly at night. Everyone believes we shall return by harvest. German records from the Third Army. 10 August provide a mirror image of the same calm tone. Crossed Meuse at dawn. Roads crowded with troops and wagons. Resistance minimal. Civilians observe from distance. Morale satisfactory. By August 11th, Belgian reports note the first bombardments. The 12th Regiment wrote, enemy artillery heard east of Tirlemont. Civilians evacuating. Supplies exhausted. Awaiting reinforcement. Private Edwin Clark of the Royal Fusiliers, who later disappeared near Mons, recorded a brief observation in his notebook on August 12th. First casualties today. Not yet sure what to write. The noise comes and stops. It feels like the weather changing. The French Red Cross Hospital at Nancy received its first wounded on August 13th. The admission ledger states, many cases of shock, few fractures. Shortage of iodine. Nurses inexperienced but willing. 2 days later, Nurse Eleanor Graves in Surrey received her first convoy of injured soldiers evacuated from Mons. Her letter of August 15th reads, they speak little. The uniforms are torn, the faces black with powder. I washed one man's hands and saw he still held part of a broken rosary. Each entry belongs to a brief window, the first 15 days of a war still described in the grammar of order. The handwriting is steady, the ink unshaken. None of the writers yet refer to loss or to duration. The terms remain administrative embarkation, requisition, movement, supply. Where feeling appears, it is contained in a single clause, tell Anne to be good. I think it will rain. Everyone believes we shall return by harvest. In historical sequence, these are the earliest known civilian and military testimonies of the European conflict. They precede propaganda, censorship, and fatigue. Their significance lies not in what they predict, but in what they omit. They record the moment before vocabulary changed, before advanced delay or loss acquired new meaning. The early record of the war, therefore, stands as an inventory, not yet a narrative. It lists men, movements, and weather with equal precision. To read it now is to see a continent entering catastrophe through the language of procedure, an entire generation writing the last pages of peace without knowing that peace had already ended. As August 1914 unfolded, the same hours were written differently in reports, letters, and communiques. The official record of one country rarely matched that of another. Even within the same army, two accounts of the same engagement could stand in quiet opposition. The result is not contradiction by intent, but the natural divergence of perception. On 7 August, the French General Staff announced what it termed the first victory of the war. Its communiqué read, "Operations near Mulhouse successful. Enemy in retreat. Morale of troops excellent." That report, printed in Paris and repeated in provincial newspapers, contrasted sharply with the field diary of the 67e Régiment d'Infanterie, operating at Mulhouse on the same date. Advance began at 0430, encountered heavy machine gun fire near Dornach, losses considerable, retreat ordered by noon. A German corps record preserved in Freiburg describes the same combat from the other side. Enemy forces entered Mulhouse in disorder pursued by our detachment. Captured 70 prisoners. Population friendly. The French Municipal Register of Mulhouse covering that same week states, population silent, shops closed, German troops entered without resistance, no cheering heard. Each document is accurate in its own frame. The staff report reflects an intention, the regimental diary a moment, the municipal record a consequence. At Liège, the first major engagement of the war generated a similar multiplicity of versions. The Belgian command reported on 6 August, fortifications holding, enemy columns repelled with heavy losses. At the same hour, the German III Corps operational diary recorded, batteries effective, Belgian resistance sporadic, outer forts neutralized. A British liaison officer, Colonel Edward Fairholme, attached to the Belgian headquarters, telegraphed to London, artillery fire continuous, Fort de Fléron damaged but still firing, situation uncertain. The Belgian communiqué was issued for morale, the German for assurance, and the British for information. None were inaccurate. None were complete. Civilian writing from within the city adds another dimension. A teacher, Jules Theroux, wrote to his brother on 7 August, "The ground shook all night. Children hid under the tables. We heard that the Germans were already inside the city, but I could still hear our guns." The municipal record, written 2 days later, confirmed the surrender of outer forts, but noted that the inner batteries continued until 16 August. In total, 10 separate documents describe the same siege. No two employ the same chronology. The disembarkation of British troops in France also appeared in conflicting form. The Times of London August reported, British forces landed at Boulogne amid cheers of the local population. The log of the transport ship City of Benares, held in Admiralty files, describes the event differently. Arrival 1830. Weather overcast. No crowds visible. Men disembarked in silence under direction of French officers. A local newspaper, Le Journal de Boulogne, published 10 August, reads, "The English arrived at night without announcement. By dawn, the port was empty again." The three sources form a composite truth, a landing completed, witnessed, but differently remembered. The first exchange of fire between British and German forces near Mons shows the same divergence. The 4th Royal Irish Dragoons reported on 22 August. Enemy cavalry encountered near Casteau. Warning shot fired by Corporal Thomas. Enemy withdrew. The German 4th Cavalry Division, diary, same date records. At dawn, small enemy patrol sighted. Exchanged fire. No casualties. A French daily, 2 days later, expanded the event into an episode of victory. The English have met the enemy. The Germans were driven back with losses. Each version stands intact within its own system of reporting, yet the reality they share is smaller than any one description. Administrative records also reveal inconsistencies. Captain Delaunay's staff note, dated 10 August, declared, "Lines of communication operating as planned. No delay in transport of troops." The Railway Administration report for the same night contradicts this claim. Traffic congestion severe. Troop trains stationary between Bar-le-Duc and Commercy. Delays of 12 hours reported. The official optimism of command documents thus coexisted with logistical accounts written in the language of difficulty. German internal communication shows similar variants. The Prussian War Ministry Bulletin of 12 August stated, "Advance in Belgium proceeding according to schedule. Civil population cooperative." The field diary of a medical orderly attached to the 9th Infantry Division describes instead, villages burned, civilians fleeing, many children among the wounded. The second entry does not contradict the first directly, but it alters the frame through which cooperative may be read. In neutral states, observation depended on position. A Dutch customs officer at Maastricht noted on 10 August, "Refugees arriving by hundreds. They ask for water and direction to Antwerp." The Dutch ministry bulletin issued that day reads, "Border calm. No influx observed." Both were correct from their respective distances, one measured individuals, the other policy. Accounts of the loss of HMS Amphion show the same phenomenon of difference. The Admiralty communique of 6th August read, "Enemy mine layer destroyed. Our ship damaged. Casualties moderate." The ship's own log, later submitted as evidence, lists 130 men lost. A letter from a sailor at Harwich simply says, "They said the losses were few. I counted more bodies than I could name." In Berlin, descriptions of the first public demonstration diverged even within the city. On a writer's journal for 5th of August, "The crowds cheer the emperor. I stay indoors. It seems safer not to look." The Berliner Tageblatt of the same day stated, "The city united in joyous demonstration. Never has Berlin shown such spirit." A police memorandum archived in the Stadtarchiv adds a third detail. Crowd estimated at 40,000. Minor injuries from congestion. One arrest for theft. Each record depicts the same event through a different lens: private apprehension, public enthusiasm, and administrative enumeration. At Mulhouse, the divergence deepened. The French regimental diary recorded withdrawal. The German report spoke of pursuit. The International Committee of the Red Cross, listing prisoner exchanges on 8th of August, registered 248 Germans and 217 French transferred between the two sides, evidence that both advances and retreats occurred within the same 24 hours. Even meteorological data reflect variation. Official bulletins for northern France recorded mild fog. Multiple field diaries describe heat and dust. The difference arises from perspective: one from an office in Paris, the other from the road to the frontier. Casualty reports followed the same pattern. The British War Office, 12th August, announced 1,000 men missing, presumed wounded. 2 months later, the same ledger corrected the figure to 277 dead. German lists from Liège reduced reported losses by half between editions. The Belgian press printed all versions successively, marking each as provisional. By mid-August, Europe possessed multiple simultaneous truths. In the same day's correspondence, a battle could be victory, stalemate, or retreat. A city could be calm, joyous, or in flames. Each nation's reports were consistent within themselves, but incompatible across borders. The difference was not deception, but structure. The world was recorded before it could be reconciled. The conflicting records of August 1914 illustrate how documentation becomes a mirror of perspective. The documents do not dispute each other's existence. They complete one another by exposing what no single voice could see. To read them together is to observe a continent entering war not through chaos, but through overlapping certainties, each written, signed, and sealed as fact. By late August 1914, the writing of war had changed its rhythm. Orders and letters that once spoke of movement now read like inventories of endurance. In the diary of Lieutenant Harold Tibbett at Mons, the day begins at 11:45. Engaged enemy infantry. Machine gun fire from Canal Bank. Casualties heavy. His next entry, written with the same steadiness, lists only numbers, ammunition, horses, time of withdrawal. A German officer across the canal recorded simply that the town was secured and the prisoners very young. Meanwhile, in the city register of Mons, officials wrote that bodies of soldiers and horses lay in the square, water pipes, broken, children removed to church. None of these writers mentioned victory. They described presence, who was there, what was broken, what remained. The retreat that followed produced hundreds of such fragments. British field reports spoke of strategic withdrawal, morale, intact communication, intermittent. The language is stable, but the meaning shifts with distance. At the same moment, a corporal in the Royal Army Medical Corps noted that stretcher cases were too many and that 2 men were left in a farmhouse with a note for burial. German batteries on the opposite ridge counted 392 shells fired and several houses burning. In a Belgian letter from Le Cateau, a farmer observed that the battle passed like thunder. By dusk, the well had run dry from smoke. All described the same afternoon in separate vocabularies, the language of command, of routine, and of witness. When the armies met again at the Marne, the official communiques regained their certainty. The French General Staff declared on 8 September that the enemy retreats in disorder, the capital is safe. British logs, the same day record troops advancing ammunition, low men fatigued. The German First Army diary refers to orderly withdrawal roads, Impassable heavy losses among transport animals. In Meaux, the city ledger lists destroyed houses and a communal burial of civilians. In the hospital at Lagny, a surgeon writes that 10 amputations were performed by candlelight. A nurse attached to the British medical train, Eleanor Graves, summarized the mood more precisely. They say victory has come, but every carriage holds the proof otherwise. Each statement is true inside its boundary. Together they form an incomplete map of what the Marne was. Through September, the tone grows quieter, even in documents of authority. German engineers near the Aisne write of continuous digging line established, while British and French entries repeat rain mud collapsing trenches. On 20th September, the word front appears for the first time in a French dispatch. Civil administrators adopt the same term in their ledgers, population reduced by half-bred, scarce church converted into hospital. Postal reports mention bicycles replacing telegraphs. London postmasters describe parcels accumulating without destination. Each archive shows the same compression movement, replaced by position speed, replaced by sequence. By early October, repetition dominates the record. Morale good. Casualties moderate. Situation stable. The phrase recurs in German, French, and English. Behind these assurances, the private letters speak another syntax. George Harris of the Lincolnshire Regiment writes, "We have not moved for days. The trenches full of water. We no longer ask when it will end." A French circular the next day warns of dysentery increasing, while the German medical department reports lice prevalent and requests soap. None of these writers use adjectives beyond necessity. Fatigue appears not as emotion, but as omission. The operational vocabulary continues to narrow. Received rations. Bread damp. No movement. Sandbags issued. Rations short. Mud waist high. The diaries of October read almost identical across languages, the handwriting shaking under rain. Official statements, however, persist in describing direction. The German communiqué of 10 October speaks of advancing toward Ypres, while British headquarters the same day reports enemy pressure increasing. Railway logs from Lille record only military trains without destination. A French summary on 15th of October defines the new phase operations, now continuous from the Channel to the Vosges, a war of positions. From that point onward, the line between document types dissolves. The difference between a communiqué, a diary, and a casualty list becomes stylistic, not structural. Every entry shares the same rhythm date, weather supplies stability. A surgeon near Saint-Omer counts amputations. A nurse writes that each man wears the same mud. A field officer notes no forward movement. Civilians record bread shortages. Military clerks note lost tools. Engineers list lengths of wire. The content of war has become measurement. By the final week of October, this transformation is complete. German orders instruct troops to strengthen defensive positions. The British Expeditionary Force concludes its month with a single sentence: no further advance. The French communiqué closes with operations static. Weather poor. Morale holding. On the civilian side, Parisian officials introduce bread rationing, and in Geneva the Red Cross reports over 100,000 inquiries for the missing. None of these documents record an ending. They mark the beginning of permanence. What deepens the record is not revelation, but density. The words repeat until meaning changes by weight alone. The language of movement, advance, withdraw, cross yields to that of persistence, hold, repair, endure. Between August and November, the same hands that once listed departure now measure mud and rain. The early confidence of we are winning fades into we are still here. Across archives, the evidence aligns more precisely than the nations that produced it. The convergence of tone is not cooperation, but fatigue. The war has reached its grammatical limit, and from that limit it will continue for 4 more years. By the end of October 1914, the documents began to close on their own. Reports that once filled entire pages now end in fragments. Some stop mid-sentence, others conclude with a line of ink and nothing after. The last entry in Lieutenant Harold Tibbet's diary from November 2nd reads almost like a breath. No word from headquarters today, the fog not lifting. All morning the sound of shells carries differently now. The next page is blank. 2 weeks later, his name appears again in a casualty list without comment. Across the channel, the final field note from the 2nd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers, written a day later, observes that enemy active trenches flooding rations late. The clerk's pen trails off into a smear. Beneath it, another hand begins the next page with previous officer killed. I continue report. The handwriting is smaller, thinner, more deliberate. The tone of someone continuing a task that has outlived its purpose. German records end in similar silence. Lieutenant Ernst Hellinger's last paragraph in the 9th Corps diary notes that artillery constant weather bad. The men ask when it will stop. I tell them tomorrow. There is no entry after. The next sheet, written by another officer, begins with logistics and no mention of Hellinger again. In Soissons, the mayor's ledger for early November records that the hospital is full, the church roof collapsing, and stops midway through the sentence. The water stains on the page form their own full stop. Letters show the same retreat into brevity. Nurse Eleanor Graves, whose correspondence had been steady for months, writes one last line from Saint-Omer. The wards overflow. I no longer ask names. The noise outside never stops. Her file contains no later letter. The German engineer, Otto Renner, who had described the retreat from the Marne with precision, ends his notebook with a sentence stripped of detail. Work continues. Ground frozen. Nothing more to add. The French regimental diary of the 132 Infantry closes in the same tone, no movement. Men tired. A Red Cross report from Lille dated the same weekends without signature. Request for medical supplies impossible. No further communication. Each archive ends differently, yet all with the same sound, the sound of the record running out. The British 1st Division file from Ypres gives its last report on the 11th of November. Enemy attack, repulsed line maintained, casualties unknown. Below it, another hand adds later. This was the last entry before the winter set in. A German wireless operator transmits at 4 in the morning. That same day, supplies delayed rain, heavy holding position, then cuts off mid-signal. A civilian diary from Arras, written by Marie Lemaire, stops on the 12th. They say it will snow. The soldiers bring candles for the cellar. The next page is torn as if time itself had taken the paper. Even official reports begin to echo the same withdrawal. The British Expeditionary Force summary for mid-November ends with the formulaic positions unchanged, morale steady. The German 4th Army report concludes trenches collapsing, artillery low on ammunition, followed by the words, end of section. In Paris, the Bulletin des Armées de la République reduces a month of fighting to one line repeated 4 times. Nothing new to report. The phrase becomes its own refrain. Private letters shrink to the size of postcards. Corporal William Dean writes home only. All quiet today, and the envelope returns stamped, returned, deceased. Civilian journals dim in the same rhythm. Anna Reiter, who had written each day since August, leaves her final words on November 17th. The shop windows, darker bread, half-size, the post, no longer comes. In Berlin, her diary ends. In Paris, the pages of the military bulletin are left blank for updates that never came. A Belgian general writing from captivity signs his last note. The forts have fallen. The duty remains. The ink drags halfway through another word and stops. Across the archives, the record contracts to fragments, dispatches, half-filled tables, interrupted transmissions. A British telegraph from Boulogne reports cable lines interrupted, no further traffic possible. The tape continues several inches perforated, but empty. A French Army weather log for November 23rd lists temperature and wind, but leaves visibility blank, a column of emptiness stretching down the page. When these fragments are read together, they create a patterned silence written in different alphabets. In later compilations, historians would label this interval simply "no significant change." Between late November and the year's end, every surviving document from the Western Front repeats a narrow sequence of phrases: position maintained, weather, poor operations, regular. The variation disappears, so does the voice behind it. The soldiers stopped writing not from indifference, but because the words had become redundant. The war had reached a point where every entry described the same day. The last record known from that winter closes with one small statement: in a German divisional notebook. The men work, eat, sleep. We wait. The handwriting moves halfway across the page and ends without a period. Weeks later, another clerk begins on the next line, dating it January 1915. There is no note about the break. What follows is not conclusion, only the sound of pages turning with nothing written on them. The climax of this record is absence, the moment where ink stops, paper continues, and the silence of the past begins to speak by itself. The papers that carried those final lines did not vanish. They scattered, crossed borders, and outlived the men who wrote them. Some were collected by military clerks at the end of the campaigns, others by local archivists who gathered fragments from attics and cellars long after the front had moved east. The handwriting faded, but the paper remained. Each fragment, folded, water-stained, and incomplete, formed the residue of that first winter of the war, the moment when movement stopped. But record continued. The diary of Lieutenant Harold W. Tibbett was recovered in 1919 from a storage trunk auctioned in Southampton. It contained his uniform, buttons, a watch, and the small notebook stamped Royal Fusiliers. The ink on the final page had bled into the paper. The sentence about fog was still legible. The book was transferred to the Imperial War Museum in 1923, where it remains under glass, its last blank page displayed as the conclusion of the exhibit on the Battle of Mons. The fragments of the 2nd Battalion Royal Welch Fusiliers Field Report survived in the National Archives at Kew. The smudged line where the officer's pen had trailed off was identified only through ultraviolet light. The subsequent handwriting, that of his replacement, continues for 2 pages more, then stops again in December. The transition between the two hands now marks for historians the rotation of command during the first months of trench warfare. Lieutenant Ernst Hellinger's journal was retrieved decades later. It had been stored with regimental records evacuated from Cologne in 1945 and reclassified as a personal file in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv at Freiburg. His final words, "I tell them tomorrow," are underlined twice. No entry follows. The unit's official casualty list from the same period confirms his disappearance, but gives no cause. The mayor's ledger from Soissons was recovered from municipal ruins after the bombardments of 1918. The ink stains on the page that ended mid-sentence had dissolved most of the text, leaving only the faint outline of the words "roof collapsing." Conservators used infrared photography to restore a portion of the writing. The fragment now resides in the Archives départementales de l'Aisne. The correspondence of Nurse Eleanor Graves was collected by her sister in Surrey and donated to the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service Archive in 1920. Her final letter, the one that spoke of names forgotten, is preserved in a climate-controlled case. The envelope still bears the watermark of the Red Cross. Her death certificate lists illness contracted in service. Her grave, unmarked at first, was later identified in the Commonwealth War Graves Register. The engineer Otto Renner's notebook was not found until 1952 during cataloging of private donations in Bremen. A note attached by his son describes it as the only thing returned from the front. The line "nothing more to add" closes the small ledger without punctuation. The following page, intended for calculations, remains empty except for the faint impression of handwriting pressed through from the previous leaf, a ghost image of the last sentence. The 132e Régiment d'Infanterie diary, lost in transport, reappeared in 1974 among declassified files in Vincennes. The entry that reads, "Oh, no movement. Men tired," is still followed by 3 blank leaves. The Red Cross report from Lille was located in Geneva's central registry, the space for signature left empty. Historians now use it to date the collapse of communication between aid stations in occupied northern France. The British 1st Division record from Ypres was transferred to the National Army Museum and digitized in 2006. The final annotation, "This was the last entry before the winter set in," was written not by a participant, but by an archivist decades later, comparing multiple regimental ledgers. Its presence shows the second life of these records, documents that record not only the war, but their own survival. The diary of Marie Lemaire from Arras was discovered in a private collection in 1987. The torn page after her note about snow had been used as a bookmark in a religious text. Paper analysis confirmed both leaves belonged to the same notebook. The remainder of her diary continues in 1915 from another town. The missing months remain blank. At the Imperial War Museum, the original telegraph tape from Bologna is preserved under acetate. The last segment, filled only with perforations and no letters, measures 12 centimeters. The curator's note identifies it as evidence of transmission failure, 2022 November 1914. It is technically a record of silence. In the French military archives, the weather ledger that stopped on 23rd of November was rediscovered in 1937. Its empty column under visibility became a reference point for climatologists studying trench conditions. No one knows why the observer left the space unfilled. Perhaps the fog was literal. Perhaps it was procedural. Either way, it stands as a gap too exact to be accidental. The standard phrase, "no significant change," introduced by the British War Office in December 1914, persisted for the next 46 months of war. By the armistice of 1918, the phrase appeared more than 1,000 times in official summaries. It had become the war's most repeated sentence, a linguistic monument to duration. The same phrase now serves archivists as a marker for missing data, an ironic continuity between the front line and the filing room. Together, these remnants trace the geography of memory: Southampton, Kew, Freiburg, Soissons, Surrey, Bremen, Vincennes, Geneva, London, Paris. Each location holds one thread of the same silence catalogued under different languages and seals. The archivists who restored them did not aim for completion. They aimed for preservation of incompleteness, the state in which the documents were left by those who had no time to finish them. Today, the original materials are held in secure repositories: the Imperial War Museum, the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, the Archives Nationales, the Red Cross Central Tracing Agency, and numerous local archives across Belgium and northern France. Each institution lists its holdings as partial. Each fragment retains its original handwriting, the ink still dark in some places, dissolved in others. The files remain open but unfinished, as if waiting for a continuation that history never provided. What remains uncertain is not their authenticity, but their chronology. In some cases, a document dated November may have been written weeks later, reconstructed from memory. In others, the writer's death left a space filled by another hand, so that the end of one life and the continuation of another share the same line. The record, like the war it describes, crosses from individual to collective without notice. The silence of those final pages was not loss, but transformation. What began as routine logs, orders, lists became a language defined by absence. The lack of conclusion is its conclusion. Each unfinished sentence stands as evidence of the point where writing met reality and stopped. In that halt lies the historical climax, not destruction, but the endurance of what could not be said. The surviving trace, therefore, is not the content, but the form, the way ink stops and paper remains. From these remnants, history reconstructs the first winter of the Great War, not through action, but through omission. The silence became the archive itself. Next time we turn to another record, a different front. A new set of pages and the same question that lingers between them. When does a document end and when does memory begin?